On the cold Monday morning of October 29, 2018, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 was cleared for takeoff at Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in Jakarta, Indonesia. It was just after dawn, and the airport was already bustling with activity, planes arriving from distant cities and passengers beginning their journeys, unaware of the tragedy that would soon unfold. Among the crowd, Lion Air Flight 610 prepared for its routine trip to Pangkal Pinang, a busy route connecting Jakarta to the small island of Bangka. The passengers, a mix of business travelers, families, and crew, settled into their seats as the engines roared to life. The sky was clear, but there was an eerie stillness in the air, the kind of calm that goes unnoticed until it is too late. As the plane lifted off the runway, everything seemed ordinary. Just another flight in the busy Lion Air fleet, one of hundreds that crisscross the skies of Indonesia daily. But something was different. Unseen to the passengers, a subtle struggle was already beginning in the cockpit. The pilots, experienced but unfamiliar with the quirks of this newly introduced Boeing 737 MAX 8, began noticing discrepancies in the aircraft's readings. The control panel flashed with warnings, indicating an issue with the plane's angle of attack sensors, the instruments that measure the plane's position relative to the air around it. These sensors, critical for keeping the plane on the right trajectory, had malfunctioned. As they ascended into the sky over the Java Sea, the plane's automated systems began to force the nose of the aircraft down, sensing a stall that wasn't happening. The pilots fought back, pulling up to keep the plane on course, unaware that the newly installed MCAS system, designed to prevent stalls, was continuously pushing the plane into a dangerous downward trajectory. For the passengers, there was little sign of the chaos unraveling in the cockpit. Some stared out the window, perhaps catching a glimpse of the sprawling city below, now fading into the distance. Others were settling into the quiet hum of the flight, anticipating the short journey ahead. But in just a few minutes, that hum would turn into something far more sinister. As the plane climbed higher, the battle between man and machine intensified. Each time the pilots tried to lift the nose, the MCAS system, relentless and automatic, fought back, pushing it down with a force that felt unstoppable. In the cockpit, Captain Bhavya Suneja and his co-pilot strained against the controls, their training kicking in. But it was a fight against an invisible hand that neither of them fully understood. Outside the cockpit, the atmosphere in the cabin remained deceptively calm, though subtle signs of unease were starting to spread. The sound of conversation had faded, replaced by the occasional nervous glance, exchanged between passengers as the aircraft jolted and dipped. A baby's cry echoed softly through the rows of seats, and a few passengers leaned forward, peering out the windows, perhaps sensing that something wasn't quite right. Yet for most, it was just a moment of mild discomfort, an unsettling bump in the air on what should have been an ordinary flight. But above them, unseen, the control tower at Soekarno-Hatta Airport was growing concerned. The pilots had radioed in to report an issue and requested to return. It was not unusual for flights to turn back due to technical difficulties, but the speed at which events were unfolding was alarming. Air traffic controllers watched the erratic altitude changes on their screens, a troubling pattern of climbs and sudden descents that told a story of increasing instability. In the cockpit, the pilots were frantically running through their emergency checklists. The MCAS system, installed to enhance safety, was now pushing them toward disaster. They had tried turning off the automated controls, but nothing seemed to work. The system kept kicking back in, forcing the plane down. The nose dipped again, more sharply this time, and a chill of realization crept in. They were losing the battle. At this point, the passengers started to feel the shifts more clearly. The smooth ascent they had expected was replaced by sharp dips and unsettling vibrations that shook the cabin. A few murmurs of concern turned into a low murmur that rippled through the rows. Oxygen masks stayed hidden, but some passengers began gripping the seats in front of them, bracing for what they didn't yet know was coming. Back in the cockpit, the pressure was building. The water of the Java Sea stretched endlessly beneath them, but they were descending too quickly. Desperation was beginning to set in. The co-pilot's voice cracked over the radio, requesting immediate assistance. But even then, it was clear. They were running out of time. Inside the cabin, the sudden dive was undeniable. The plane tilted forward, and passengers were jerked against their seatbelts, gasps and cries filling the air. The baby that had been crying moments earlier was now silent, as if sensing the collective fear swelling around it. Overhead, compartments rattled, and the overhead signs flashed warnings. The once casual atmosphere had turned tense and electric, charged with an impending sense of doom. The pilots were still fighting, still hoping for a solution that wasn't coming. The ground was rushing toward them now, fast and unforgiving. There was no more time. At 6:32 a.m., the Boeing 737 MAX 8 plummeted into the waters of the Java Sea, the sound of the impact silencing everything in an instant. The stillness that followed was almost impossible to comprehend. What had been a routine flight filled with everyday moments, business people making plans, families headed toward reunions, was now submerged in the cold depths of the Java Sea. All 189 lives on board were lost in an instant. The wreckage of Lion Air Flight 610 scattered across the water's surface, pieces of metal and personal belongings floating in the aftermath of unimaginable devastation. Back on land, the world was just beginning to wake to the tragedy. The control tower at Sakano-Hatta International Airport had lost contact with the aircraft moments before the crash, and confusion rippled through the halls of the airport as news spread of the missing plane. Family members waiting in Pangkalpinang would soon receive the heart-wrenching calls, their hopeful anticipation giving way to shock and grief. Search and rescue teams were dispatched almost immediately, racing against time to locate any survivors, a hope that would fade as hours passed. Helicopters circled above the crash site, while boats combed the waters, retrieving debris and fragments of lives once whole. The scale of the disaster slowly became clear, and the magnitude of the loss settled over Indonesia like a heavy fog. As the investigation began, the world's attention turned to the Boeing 737 MAX 8. This wasn't just a freak accident. The same aircraft model had been flagged for safety concerns in recent months, with the MCAS system at the heart of it. The investigation into the crash of Lion Air Flight 610 soon zeroed in on a specific part of the aircraft, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. This system, designed to prevent the plane from stalling by automatically adjusting its nose downward, had become the central culprit in the tragedy. It was a critical component introduced in the Boeing 737 MAX 8 to compensate for the larger, more fuel-efficient engines that altered the plane's aerodynamics. However, what was meant to be a safety enhancement had turned into a deadly flaw. MCAS relied on data from two angle of attack AOA sensors, which measure the plane's orientation relative to the flow of air. If the sensors detected that the nose was too high, suggesting the aircraft was at risk of stalling, MCAS would automatically push the nose down to prevent the stall. But in the case of Lion Air Flight 610, the system was fatally flawed. One of the AOA sensors had malfunctioned, sending erroneous data to the MCAS. Instead of a stall, the plane was flying normally. But the system continuously misread the situation and forced the nose down, despite the pilot's efforts to counteract it. Boeing's design compounded the problem. The MCAS system was designed to activate based on the input of just one AOA sensor, meaning if that sensor failed, the system would still force the plane into a dive, as happened on Flight 610. What's more, the pilots weren't fully trained on how to disable the MCAS. In fact, many of them weren't even aware of its existence, as the system wasn't prominently featured in the training for the 737 MAX 8. This lack of knowledge, combined with the aggressive nature of MCAS and the faulty sensor, created a situation where the pilots were locked in a losing battle with the plane's own automation. In the aftermath of the crash, Boeing and global aviation authorities faced intense scrutiny. It was revealed that the company had failed to disclose critical details about MCAS to airlines, believing the system would operate unnoticed by pilots in most situations. The design flaw, the lack of redundancy in the sensor system, and inadequate pilot training all contributed to a disaster that could have been avoided. The repercussions were swift. Boeing grounded its entire 737 MAX fleet, and regulators worldwide banned the aircraft from flying until the MCAS system could be redesigned. In the months that followed, similar flaws were discovered in other planes, and a second crash involving the same model, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, further exposed the deep-rooted problems with the 737 MAX 8.